Tonight, we're going to walk on some very old dusty roads. We're going to join a group of friends on the greatest adventure of their lives. They were fishermen and farmers, normal people just like us. But they chose to follow a teacher named Jesus. You'll feel the sun on your face as you walk from town to town with no map and no plan. You'll listen to stories that are easy to hear, but hard to understand. And you'll see amazing things happen that you can't quite explain. So get comfortable and let the adventure start. Chapter 1. The Call by the Sea. The sun rose over the Sea of Galilee, painting the water in hues of molten gold and casting long, wavering shadows from the fishing boats dotting its surface. For Simon Peter and his brother Andrew, it was the beginning of another day defined by the rhythms of the sea, the pull of the nets, the smell of fish and brine, the familiar ache in their shoulders from a long night's labor. Their small boat rocked gently on the swells as they worked, their movements practiced and automatic, the fabric of their lives woven from the threads of tradition and toil. The world they knew was measured in catches and seasons, in the weight of a full net and the worry of an empty one. It was into this world of water and work that a stranger came walking along the shore. His approach was quiet, but something in his presence stilled the very air around him. Simon Peter noticed him first, pausing in his work to watch the figure drawing nearer. There was an authority in his step, a clarity in his gaze that seemed to look past the surface of things and into the depths of the heart. The brothers watched, their hands still holding the coarse, wet nets, as the man stopped at the water's edge and looked directly at them. He called out to them, his voice carrying over the water with a resonance that felt both foreign and familiar. He invited them to follow him, to exchange their nets for a different kind of catch, a catch of men. The words hung in the air, simple yet staggering, an offer that unraveled the entirety of their existence in a single moment. To leave the boat meant abandoning their livelihood, the security of a known trade, the identity they had built with their own hands. It meant walking away from their families, from the expectations of their community, from the very shore that had defined their lives. Yet, as they looked from the stranger's face to the nets in their hands, a strange and compelling certainty settled over them. It was a feeling that bypassed reason, a pull stronger than the tide. Without a word passing between them, Simon Peter let the net fall from his grasp. It splashed into the water, the sinkers pulling it down into the dark. Andrew did the same, his movements decisive. They stepped out of the boat, the water cool around their ankles, and waded to shore, leaving behind the vessel that had been their home and workplace. Their feet met the pebbled beach, and they fell into step behind the man called Jesus. A tumult of emotions churned within them, a thrilling, dizzying excitement at the sheer audacity of the act, mixed with a cold, sharp fear of the unknown. With every step away from the sea, the weight of what they had left behind grew heavier. They thought of their families, of the explanations they would never give, of the empty place at the table that evening. They were untethered now, their future a blank page. They walked, the dust of the road coating their sandals, and wondered what this new life would demand of them, what kind of men they would become, and what it truly meant to be fishers of men. Chapter 2. Leaving everything behind. The scent of tar and salt hung thick in the air around Zebedee's fishing operation. A familiar perfume of industry, and inheritance. James and his younger brother John worked side by side with their father, their hands moving in practiced rhythm as they mended the torn nets spread across the sun-baked stones. The coarse fibers snagged against their calloused fingers. Each knot they tied a small promise of future catches, of continued provision. This was the life they knew, the steady, sun-bleached certainty of the family business, a legacy passed from father to son along the shores of Galilee. The future was a simple, linear path, stretching out as predictably as the horizon over the water. Then he appeared, the same man their friends Simon and Andrew had followed days before. Jesus walked toward them with an unhurried purpose, his gaze fixed on the two brothers. The world seemed to narrow to the space between them, the clatter of the harbor fading into a distant hum. He did not need to call out. His presence was the summons. He simply looked at them, and in that look James and John saw an invitation that went beyond words, a call to a different kind of work, a different kind of family. The command was implicit, echoing in the silence he brought with him. James was the first to move, setting down the netting needle with a finality that made the air still. John followed, his eyes wide, glancing from Jesus to their father. Zebedee had stopped his work, his weathered face a canvas of confusion and dawning loss. He looked at his sons, then at the stranger who was asking for everything without uttering a single demand. There were no lengthy explanations, no promises of return. The goodbye was a quiet, painful severing. James placed a hand on his father's shoulder, a touch that conveyed a lifetime of gratitude and the ache of a sudden departure. John embraced him briefly, feeling the solid strength of the man who had taught them everything they knew about the sea and nothing about leaving it. They turned their backs on the boats, on the piles of mended nets, on their father standing alone amidst the tools of his trade. With each step away from the shore, the reality of their choice settled upon them like a physical weight. They were walking away from financial security, from the known rhythms of buying and selling, of profit and loss. The discussion passed between them in hushed, urgent tones as they followed the figure of Jesus up the dusty path. They spoke of the risks, of the sheer madness of abandoning a thriving business for a life of itinerant wandering. They had no salary, no savings, no home to return to at night. Their safety net was gone, and all they had now was the man walking ahead of them. The path began to climb, and James looked back one last time. The sea was a sheet of blue glass in the distance, and the figures on the shore were small and indistinct. The life he had known was now a miniature painting, beautiful and unreachable. He felt a profound emptiness in his pockets and a deeper hollow in his stomach. They had no plan, no provisions, and no guarantee of their next meal. Their entire existence was now predicated on a single, terrifying fact. They were relying only on Jesus. The sun beat down on their backs, and the dust of the road coated their feet, the first layer of a new identity being formed with every uncertain step into an unknown future. Chapter 3. First Nights on the Road. The road stretched before them, a pale ribbon of dust winding through the rolling hills of Galilee. For Simon Peter, Andrew, James, and John, each step was a lesson in a new kind of poverty, a shedding of the world's certainties. The familiar weight of coins was gone from their belts, replaced by the lighter, more disquieting burden of total dependence. Their first destination was a small village clinging to a hillside, its stone houses huddled together like sheep against the evening chill. As the sun bled into the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet and orange, the reality of their homelessness became as palpable as the cooling air. That first night, they slept not in beds, but on a patch of hard ground at the edge of an olive grove, the gnarled branches of the ancient trees silhouetted against a tapestry of stars. The ground was unyielding, and every small stone seemed to press directly into their ribs. Peter lay on his back, his cloak pulled tight against the night's chill, his stomach growling with a hollow emptiness. He stared up at the countless pinpricks of light, feeling simultaneously insignificant and chosen, a paradox that twisted in his gut. The others shifted restlessly around him, their quiet sighs and the rustle of their cloaks the only sounds breaking the stillness. They were tired, their muscles aching from the unaccustomed miles, their minds weary from the constant low-grade hum of uncertainty. The next day brought a meager breakfast of bread and olives offered by a sympathetic woman at a village well. Her kindness, a small bright flame in the gathering gloom of their need. They traveled on, their sandals kicking up puffs of pale dust, their throats dry. Their survival hinged on the generosity of strangers. A handful of dates here, a scoop of lentils there, a place to rest in the shade of a courtyard. Each act of charity was a temporary reprieve, a thread keeping them from unraveling completely. Yet, with each gift received, Peter felt the knot of anxiety in his chest tighten. What would happen when the kindness ran out? When they reached a village where no one had heard of the teacher from Nazareth? Throughout it all, Jesus moved with an unshakable calm that was both comforting and confounding. He did not seem to notice the dust or the hunger with the same acute distress as his followers. His presence was a steady anchor in their drifting existence. When they entered a village, he would speak to the people who gathered, his voice weaving stories of seeds and soils, of lost coins and found sheep. The crowds listened, their faces transforming from curiosity to wonder, and in those moments the disciples felt a flicker of the purpose that had drawn them from their nets. But when the crowds dispersed and the last echoes of his teaching faded, the mundane fears returned, sharper and more persistent. On the third evening, as they settled against a low stone wall overlooking a sleeping village, Peter could bear the silence no longer. The others were already lying down, their bodies curled against the cold. He sat beside Jesus, who was gazing out at the darkened landscape, his profile serene in the faint starlight. The words tumbled out of Peter, low and strained, a confession of the fear that had been gnawing at him for days. He spoke of the emptiness in their bellies, the uncertainty of the coming day, the simple, terrifying question of where their next meal would come from. He laid bare the practical, grinding worry of a fisherman who knew the cost of everything and now possessed nothing. He expected reassurance, a promise, a plan. Instead, Jesus simply turned his head and looked at him, his eyes holding a deep, quiet knowing that seemed to absorb Peter's fear without being diminished by it. He said nothing, but in that silence, Peter felt his frantic questions lose their edge, not because they were answered, but because they were held in a peace that defied all reason. The night settled around them, vast and cold, but for a moment Peter felt a different kind of warmth, one that had nothing to do with fire or food and everything to do with the calm unwavering presence sitting beside him in the dark. Chapter 4. A Wedding Miracle. The journey to Cana was a welcome respite, a ribbon of road leading not to a dusty marketplace or a crowded hillside, but to a celebration. The air itself seemed to change as they approached the village, carrying the distant, joyful strains of music and the rich, savory scents of roasting lamb and baking bread. For the disciples, the wedding feast was a brief return to a world they understood, a world of community, of laughter, of the simple, profound joy of a union blessed by family and friends. They entered the crowded courtyard, the vibrant colors of wedding garments, a stark contrast to their own travel-stained robes, and for a few precious hours the gnawing anxieties of the road were forgotten in the rhythm of clapping hands and the sweetness of shared wine. But as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and crimson, a subtle tension began to weave through the festivities. The disciples, attuned now to the undercurrents of any gathering, noticed the hushed, urgent conversations between the servants, the worried glances exchanged by the stewards, the way the mother of the groom moved through the crowd with a strained smile. The wine was running out. It was a social catastrophe of the highest order, a stain of dishonor that would linger over the new family for years. The celebration's vibrant energy began to falter, the laughter growing forced, the music losing its heart. It was then that Jesus' mother approached him, her quiet words lost in the general din, but her expression speaking volumes of a mother's quiet plea. The disciples watched, curious, as Jesus responded with a calm that seemed to deepen the silence around them. He then gestured toward 6 large stone water jars standing against the wall, vessels meant for the Jewish rites of purification. At his instruction, the servants, their faces etched with confusion and a sliver of desperate hope, began to fill the jars to the brim with water, the liquid sloshing heavily against the stone. The task was simple, mundane, a chore performed 1,000 times, yet an electric anticipation crackled in the air. Then came the next impossible command. Jesus told the servants to draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet. The disciples watched, their breath held, as a servant dipped a pitcher into the clear, cool water. But when he poured it into the cup, what emerged was not the pale, tasteless liquid of the well. It was a deep, rich crimson, the color of a summer sunset, catching the torchlight and glowing with an unearthly luminescence. The master of the banquet took a sip, his eyes widening in astonishment. A broad smile broke across his face as he turned to the bridegroom, loudly praising him for saving the best wine for last, a breach of all custom and tradition. A stunned silence fell over the disciples who had witnessed the entire sequence. They stood frozen, their eyes locked on the cup, on the servants now hurriedly filling other cups with the impossible vintage, on the faces of the guests transforming from polite concern to bewildered delight. Andrew's hand went to his mouth. James and John exchanged a look of pure, unadulterated shock. Peter simply stared, his mind reeling, unable to process the evidence of his own eyes. This was not a healing, not a wise teaching, but a flagrant, joyous defiance of nature itself. Water, simple, elemental water, had become wine. The very laws of creation had been bent at his quiet request. Later, as they left the festivities and walked under a canopy of brilliant stars, the miracle hung in the air between them, a shared secret too vast to contain. Their whispers were urgent, awestruck. They spoke of the power they had just witnessed, a power that held no precedent in their understanding of prophets or holy men. It was a creative power, a power that spoke of authority not just over sickness or demons, but over the fundamental substance of the world. What did it mean to follow a man who commanded the elements? If he could transform water into the finest wine for a simple village wedding, what future lay ahead for them? The fears of the road, the hunger, the homelessness suddenly seemed small, reframed by the staggering reality of the one they followed. They walked on through the cool night, no longer just followers of a teacher, but witnesses to a power that was rewriting the world before their very eyes. And they trembled with a mixture of holy fear and dawning, incomprehensible hope. Chapter 5. Learning from Stories. The crowds gathered like flocks of thirsty sheep, their faces upturned and hopeful, pressing in from every side until the disciples found themselves forming a human bulwark around Jesus. The air hummed with the buzz of 1,000 murmured questions and the dry rustle of cloaks in the afternoon heat. Then Jesus began to speak, and his voice, calm and clear, cut through the noise, painting pictures with words. He told them a story of a farmer striding across a field, his hand casting seed with a broad rhythmic sweep. The disciples listened, their minds tracing the arc of the seeds as they fell, some onto the hard-packed path, only to be snatched away by birds, some onto shallow, rocky soil where they sprouted quickly but withered under the sun, some among thorns that choked the life from them, and some, at last, onto good, rich earth that yielded a harvest beyond imagining. The story was simple, a rustic vignette from a world they all knew, yet it landed with the weight of a riddle, its true meaning hovering just out of reach. The crowd listened, some nodding with thoughtful appreciation, others with faces blank and uncomprehending, and the disciples themselves felt a familiar, frustrating confusion clouding their minds. Later, when the crowds had dispersed and the last stragglers had wandered back to their homes and fields, the small group found a moment of quiet solitude on a grassy slope overlooking the lake. The setting sun gilded the water, and the evening brought a welcome coolness. It was then, in the intimacy of their small circle, that the questions they had held back finally surfaced. They asked him about the story, their voices low and earnest. Why speak in these parables? Why cloak the truth in the garments of farming and feasts, of lost coins and wayward sons? Why not speak plainly so that everyone could understand? Jesus looked at them, his gaze holding a profound patience that seemed to soften the edges of their frustration. He explained that the stories were a gift and a test, a way of revealing the secrets of the kingdom to hearts that were ready to receive them, while allowing the indifferent and the hostile to hear only a simple tale. The ability to understand was itself a form of faith, a listening that went beyond the ear and into the spirit. He then began to unravel the parable of the sower, his words plucking the images from the story and planting them deep within their own souls. The path was the heart hardened by the world's traffic, where truth could find no purchase. The rocky soil was the shallow emotional reception that crumbled under the heat of trouble. The thorns were the relentless, choking worries of life and the deceitful lure of wealth. But the good soil, he said, was the heart that heard the word, understood it, and held it fast, producing a yield of perseverance and love that could weather any storm. As he spoke, a new landscape began to form in their minds, not of seeds and soils, but of the inner terrain of the human heart. They saw their own reflections in the different grounds, the times their own faith had felt shallow, the moments when the thorns of daily anxiety had threatened to choke their newfound purpose. They were learning that following him was not merely about witnessing miracles on the road, but about this slow, patient cultivation of the soul, this difficult art of true listening. In the deepening twilight, Andrew, usually so quiet and observant, found the courage to voice the vulnerability they all felt. He looked at Jesus, his expression open and unguarded, and admitted that he often felt lost in a fog of confusion, that for every moment of clarity there were a dozen more where he felt he was grasping at shadows. It was a confession that hung in the air not as a failure, but as an act of trust, and in response Jesus did not scold or offer a simple answer. He simply continued to teach, his patient presence itself a lesson that understanding was a journey, and that a heart willing to admit its confusion was the most fertile soil of all. Chapter 6. Healing a Leper. They saw him long before he drew near, a solitary figure moving with the halting, hesitant gait of the condemned. He was a man carved from isolation, his body wrapped in the tattered rags that marked him as unclean, his face shadowed by the hood he pulled low. A collective, instinctive recoil passed through the disciples as he approached, a physical flinch born of a lifetime of ingrained fear. Leprosy was not merely a sickness, it was a living death, a sentence of exile that severed a person from every human touch, from family, from community, from God's own temple. The law was clear, its boundaries as sharp as a blade. Stay away, cry out, unclean, and live apart. To touch a leper was to contract his defilement, to become untouchable oneself. But the man did not cry out. He simply fell to his knees in the dust a dozen paces from Jesus, his body trembling not from the disease, but from a desperate, audacious hope. His voice, when it came, was a ragged tear in the fabric of the afternoon. He did not ask for alms or for kind words. He professed a belief that was both a declaration and a plea, stating that Jesus possessed the power to make him clean, if he was only willing. The words hung in the air, a direct challenge to the established order of purity and pollution. The disciples held their breath, their minds racing with the implications. Would Jesus, like any righteous teacher, rebuke the man for breaking the law of separation? Would he offer a prayer from a safe distance and send him on his way? Jesus did neither. He looked at the man, and his gaze was not one of revulsion or clinical distance, but of a deep, piercing compassion that seemed to see past the ravaged flesh to the human soul trapped within. Then, in an act that shattered every convention and defied every warning, he moved. He stepped forward, closing the forbidden distance, and he reached out his hand. The disciples watched, stunned into immobility, as his fingers, clean and whole, made contact with the diseased, broken skin. The touch was not hesitant, not a symbolic gesture, but a firm, intentional connection. In that single, silent moment, the world turned upside down. Holiness was not defiled by the unclean. Instead, holiness poured into the defilement and consumed it. A gasp rippled through the small crowd that had gathered at a safe distance. The leper shuddered, a convulsion that seemed to start at the point of contact and ripple through his entire frame. The pallid, dead patches of skin on his face began to flush with the healthy pink of new life. The scaly, rough texture smoothed out, becoming soft and whole. The disfigurement that had been his identity for years melted away like wax before a flame, leaving behind the unmarked face of a man restored. He was clean, not just healed, but cleansed, purified, made fit again for human society, for family, for worship. The man looked down at his own hands, turning them over and over, his eyes wide with a disbelieving joy that was painful to behold. Jesus instructed him to go and show himself to the priests, to offer the sacrifices commanded by Moses as a testimony to them. But as the man, now whole, hurried away with tears streaming down his renewed face, the disciples were left to grapple with the aftershocks of the miracle. They had witnessed power, yes, the same power that turned water to wine. But more than that, they had witnessed a radical, terrifying compassion that recognized no boundaries of ritual purity, no walls of social ostracism. Following Jesus, they realized with a dawning, humbling clarity, meant more than learning doctrines or witnessing wonders. It meant embracing a mercy so vast it willingly touched the untouchable. It meant seeing the outcast not as a problem to be avoided, but as a person to be restored. In the days that followed, as they traveled to other villages, they carried that lesson with them. They watched Jesus and they began to practice. When they encountered the sick, they did not shrink back. Andrew found himself kneeling beside a feverish child, placing a hand on her burning forehead, channeling the authority Jesus had given them to heal. James and John spoke words of peace to a man tormented by spirits, their voices firm with a borrowed confidence. They were clumsy at first, their faith a flickering candle next to the bonfire of Christ's own. But they were learning. They were learning that the authority to heal was inseparable from the compassion that compelled the touch, and that to follow him was to step into the messy, broken places of the world with hands outstretched, ready to make clean. Chapter 7. Feeding a huge crowd. The crowd was a sea of need, a vast, shifting tapestry of humanity that stretched across the grassy slope and down to the water's edge. 5,000 men plus women and children, a number so large it felt abstract until you saw the countless faces, each one hungry for something more than the teacher's words. They had followed him here, to this remote place, drawn by a hope they could not name, leaving behind the practicalities of meals and provisions. Now, as the sun began its long, slow descent, painting the sky in washes of gold and rose, the practicalities returned with a vengeance. The air, once charged with the electricity of his teaching, now grew thick with the unspoken anxiety of empty stomachs and the long walk home. The disciples felt the tension coiling in the crowd, a restlessness that threatened to sour the day's miracles. It was Philip who voiced the looming crisis first, his voice tight with pragmatic alarm as Jesus tested him with a question about buying bread. Philip's mind raced through calculations, his fisherman's grasp of numbers failing utterly against the scale of the need. 8 months' wages would not buy enough for each person to have even a mouthful. The other disciples murmured their agreement, their faces etched with the same helpless concern. This was not a problem of faith, but of simple, brutal arithmetic. They were surrounded by a multitude in a deserted place, and the hour was late. The only sane, responsible course of action was to send them away, to disperse the crowd back toward the villages where they might scrounge for food before nightfall. But Jesus, his gaze sweeping over the vast assembly as if looking at a field ready for harvest, rejected their logic. His calm instruction was a paradox that defied all reason. You give them something to eat. The words landed not as a command, but as an impossibility, a statement so contrary to reality, it left them speechless. They looked at their empty hands, at the empty ground, at the endless rows of expectant faces. Give them what? The air itself. It was Andrew, ever the one to scout for possibilities, who brought forward the only tangible offering, his voice laced with a resignation that bordered on apology. A boy in the crowd had a meager stash, 5 small barley loaves, coarse and flat, and 2 tiny salted fish, a lunch fit for a child and no one else. Andrew presented them as if offering a pebble to dam a river, his gesture a silent admission of the absurdity of the task. The disciples watched as Jesus took the pitiful provisions, his hands cradling the loaves and fish, not with dismay, but with a quiet reverence. He looked up to heaven, his face tilted toward the fading light, and gave thanks. The prayer was not a plea, but a declaration of gratitude for what was already mysteriously enough. Then came the breaking. Jesus took a loaf, and his hands did not simply divide it, they multiplied it. The single loaf became 2, then 4, then a cascade of bread that seemed to flow from his fingers like grain from an unending sack. The disciples stood frozen, their minds refusing to process the evidence of their eyes. The laws of nature, of conservation, of simple multiplication were being rewritten before them in a silent, glorious defiance. He did the same with the fish, the 2 small bodies becoming a school, then a sea of them, their silvery scales glinting in the twilight. A basket was thrust into Peter's hands, and the spell was broken. The disciples moved then, not as planners or providers, but as conduits, as servants in a miracle they could not control. They waded into the crowd, their baskets heavy with bread and fish that had not existed moments before. They moved from family to family, from group to group, handing out the food. A woman received a piece of bread, her eyes wide with wonder as she tore into it. A man accepted a fish, his hunger momentarily forgotten in his astonishment. The disciples kept passing out the food, their arms tiring, their baskets miraculously never lightening. However much they gave, however many hands they filled, the supply within the woven reeds remained constant, an unending fountain of sustenance. They lost count of the trips, of the faces, of the murmured thanks. They were simply part of the flow now, agents of a grace that was physically, tangibly overflowing. The quiet chewing of 5,000 people, the satisfied sighs, the laughter of children with full bellies, these were the only sounds that broke the holy silence that had fallen over the hillside. When the last person had eaten their fill, when the last crumb had been distributed, Jesus instructed them to gather the leftovers. They moved through the crowd again, this time collecting the fragments, and as they did, another layer of the miracle revealed itself. They filled 12 large baskets, each one heavy with the abundance that remained. There was more left over than they had started with. As they stood amidst the satisfied multitude, the empty baskets now full, the truth settled upon them with the weight of a divine revelation. Their earlier fears of scarcity, of impossibility, of their own inadequacy seemed like childish worries in the face of this lavish provision. They looked at Jesus, who was watching the crowds begin their journey home, his expression serene. They realized, with a shock that was both humbling and exhilarating, that he was not merely a teacher of truths or a worker of wonders. He was the source. He could provide for every need, physical and spiritual, even when the situation seemed utterly hopeless, even when their own resources amounted to nothing more than 5 loaves and 2 fish. The impossible was not a barrier for him. It was his chosen canvas. And in that moment, their faith, which had been a flickering candle, caught a new and brilliant flame, burning with the certainty that the one who could feed a multitude in a wilderness would never let his own go hungry. Chapter 8. Walking on Water. The storm descended with a sudden, brutal fury, as if the very sky had cracked open. One moment, the Sea of Galilee was a placid sheet of twilight blue, and the next, it was a churning chaos of black water and shrieking wind. The disciples' boat, which had felt so sturdy and familiar when they pushed off from the shore, was now a fragile shell tossed between towering waves that rose like liquid mountains before crashing down with the force of collapsing cliffs. Icy spray lashed their faces, and the groaning timbers of the vessel sounded like the death cries of a great beast. They worked frantically, muscles straining against the oars, bailing water with cracked leather buckets, their shouts torn away by the gale. All the while, the shore remained a distant, mocking line, impossibly far across the heaving darkness. Fear was a cold stone in each of their bellies, a primal terror that had long since eclipsed the memory of the day's miracles. The miraculous bread that had filled them hours before felt like a dream from another lifetime, utterly irrelevant in the face of this drowning reality. It was in the deepest part of the night, when hope had worn thin and exhaustion was beginning to win its battle against panic, that they saw it, a figure, pale and indistinct, moving toward them across the raging water. It did not swim or struggle against the waves. It walked, its steps as calm and measured as a man strolling through a sunlit field. A collective cry of pure terror ripped from their throats, a sound more primal than the wind. They were sure it was a phantom, a spirit of the deep come to claim them, a final supernatural seal on their doom. Their hearts hammered against their ribs, and they clung to the pitching boat, their faces masks of superstitious dread. Then a voice cut through the storm's roar, a voice they knew, familiar and impossibly calm. It told them to take courage, to not be afraid. It was him. The recognition was a shock that momentarily stilled the storm inside them. It was Jesus, walking on the very substance that was trying to kill them, treating the chaotic sea as if it were solid ground. The impossibility of it was staggering, a defiance of physics that made the multiplication of loaves seem almost logical by comparison. Yet there he was, his form becoming clearer as he drew near, untouched by the spray, unbothered by the wind. Peter, always the first to act, his fear now warring with a sudden wild surge of faith, called out into the shrieking darkness. He shouted a challenge that was also a plea, asking that, if it was truly Jesus, to command him to come out on the water. The other disciples stared at him as if he had lost his mind. The response came back, immediate and simple. Come. It was a single word, an invitation into the impossible. Without another moment's hesitation, Peter swung his legs over the side of the bucking boat. His feet, calloused and familiar with the feel of a wooden deck, met not the cold, sucking plunge of the deep, but a surface as firm as stone. He stood up, his balance precarious, his eyes locked on Jesus. For a few breathtaking heartbeats, he walked. He took one step, then another, his sandals meeting the crest of a wave as if it were a solid hill. The wind still howled, the water still churned, but he was above it, participating in the miracle, a man walking on water. But then he made the mistake of looking down. He saw the black, hungry depths yawning beneath his feet. He felt the full, brutal force of the gale tearing at his robes. His mind, trained for a lifetime in the logic of sinking and swimming, reasserted its terrible authority. The faith that had been a bridge beneath him evaporated, and in its place rushed the cold, hard truth of gravity and drowning water. A strangled cry escaped his lips as he began to sink, the solid surface turning to liquid betrayal, pulling him down into the icy embrace of the sea. He had time only to gasp a single desperate name before a strong hand closed around his wrist, arresting his plunge. Jesus was there, pulling him up, his grip firm and sure. As Peter stood again, shaking and dripping on the impossible surface, Jesus looked at him, his eyes holding not anger, but a profound, searching sadness. He spoke a gentle rebuke that cut deeper than any accusation, questioning the smallness of his faith, the fragility of his trust that had faltered so quickly after such a bold beginning. Together, they walked the short distance back to the boat, and as Jesus climbed in, the storm, as if it had been holding its breath, simply ceased. The wind died to a whisper, the waves flattened into a glassy calm, and an eerie, profound silence fell over the sea and the men within the boat. No one spoke. The disciples simply sat or knelt or stood staring, their clothes soaked with spray and sweat, their minds reeling. They had witnessed a power that commanded not just bread and bodies, but the untamed elements themselves. They had seen a faith that could walk on water, and they had seen that same faith drown in a moment of fear. The lesson was written on Peter's ashen face and in the sudden, humbling quiet of the calmed sea. Following Jesus required more than awe, more than excitement, more than full stomachs. It required a trust that had to hold fast even when the world was falling apart, even when the water was rising, even when every logical instinct screamed to sink. It was a trust that looked only at him and never at the storm. Chapter 9. Arguments with leaders. The tension in the synagogue was a palpable force, thick and heavy as a storm cloud about to break. It had begun with a simple act of compassion, a miracle that should have inspired only wonder and praise. A man with a withered hand had stood before them, his limb a useless, shrunken thing tucked against his chest. Jesus had looked at him, then at the religious leaders clustered like vultures in their places of honor, their faces hard and expectant. The unspoken challenge hung in the air. Would he break their sacred rules? And he had, of course he had. With a word, the shriveled flesh had filled out, the bent fingers had straightened, and the man had moved his hand, whole, strong, and perfect, in front of their disbelieving eyes. But it was the Sabbath, the day of rest, governed by a web of restrictions so intricate they had become a cage. The leaders did not see the restoration of a human life. They saw only the splintering of their authority, the tearing of a social fabric they had painstakingly woven. Their criticism was not a quiet dissent, but a sharp public indictment, their voices laced with a venomous righteousness that turned the holy space into a courtroom. They accused Jesus of being an agent of chaos, a lawbreaker who dishonored God by working on the day God had rested. Their words were not aimed solely at him. They were a warning shot fired over the heads of the men who followed him, a clear demarcation of the line they were crossing by aligning themselves with this radical from Nazareth. The disciples felt the weight of those accusing gazes, and a nervous energy prickled along their skin. They stood slightly behind Jesus, a small, uncertain bulwark against the rising tide of official displeasure. Andrew found his hands were trembling, and he clasped them tightly behind his back. James and John exchanged worried glances, their minds racing with the practical consequences of this very public confrontation. To be criticized by these men was not a mere difference of opinion. It was to be marked. It could mean exclusion from the synagogue, the loss of their standing in the community, the turning of former friends into wary strangers or even active enemies. The safe, structured world of their upbringing was crumbling at its foundations, and they were standing squarely in the dust of its collapse. Jesus, however, did not shrink from the argument. His responses were not defensive, but offensive, turning their legalistic traps back upon them with a devastating logic. He spoke of pulling a sheep from a pit on the Sabbath, an act of mercy their own traditions allowed. Was a man not worth more than a sheep? His voice, calm yet ringing with an authority that silenced the room, cut to the very heart of the matter. He declared that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The words were a revolution, reframing God's law not as a burden to be borne, but as a gift to be used for human good. He spoke of being Lord even of the Sabbath, a claim so staggering it left a breathless silence in its wake. The leaders could only stare, their faces mottled with fury and impotence, their theological certainties shattered by a truth too large for their rules to contain. Later, as they left the synagogue and walked through the narrow streets of the town, the disciples huddled closer together, their voices low and urgent. They discussed their fears in hushed tones, the boldness of Jesus' words echoing in their minds. Peter confessed the cold knot of anxiety in his stomach, the fear of the trouble that was surely coming. Would they be arrested, stoned, forced to flee in the night? They were simple fishermen, not revolutionaries. They had signed up to learn, to witness miracles, to be part of something new. But they had not fully understood that the new thing would demand a war with the old. They wrestled with the cost, the stark realization that following this man meant embracing conflict, not avoiding it. It meant standing with him when he was opposed, even when that opposition came from the most powerful and respected men they knew. The path ahead was no longer a dusty road between villages. It was a narrow ledge over a precipice, and the wind was beginning to howl. Chapter 10. A glorious moment. The climb was steep, a rugged path that wound its way up the mountain's flank, leaving the familiar world of dust and debate far below. Jesus had chosen only 3, Peter, James, and John, for this ascent, a selection that filled them with a curious mixture of pride and apprehension. The air grew thinner and cooler as they climbed, the sounds of the village fading into a profound silence, broken only by the scuff of their sandals on stone and their own labored breathing. The higher they went, the more the world seemed to fall away, until they stood on a small level shelf of rock near the summit, a place that felt suspended between heaven and earth. The purpose of the journey was a mystery, an unspoken promise that hung in the crisp, thin air. Then, as Jesus began to pray, the mystery began to unravel in a way that shattered all their expectations. His face, usually so human and familiar, began to change. It did not merely glow with sweat or effort, it shone with a light that seemed to come from within, a radiance as fierce and pure as the sun, bleaching the color from his robes until they became a dazzling, impossible white, whiter than any fuller on earth could bleach them. The very air around him seemed to thicken and hum with a tangible holiness, a pressure that pushed against their skin and made the hairs on their arms stand on end. This was not the teacher they knew. This was a being of unapproachable light, a glimpse of a glory so vast it threatened to unmoor them from reality itself. As they watched, paralyzed with awe, two other figures materialized from the shimmering air beside him, their forms outlined in the same unearthly luminescence. They were men, yet they carried the weight of ages in their bearing. One had the stern lawgiver's countenance of Moses, the great liberator who had spoken with God on another mountain and received the tablets of the covenant. The other had the fiery, unyielding eyes of Elijah, the prophet who had been taken to heaven in a whirlwind of fire. They were speaking with Jesus, their conversation a low, resonant murmur about an exodus he was about to fulfill in Jerusalem, a departure that spoke of both triumph and suffering. The past and the future were collapsing into this single, transcendent moment on the mountaintop. Peter, his heart pounding like a wild drum against his ribs, felt an overwhelming urge to respond, to somehow capture and contain this impossible glory. The terror and the wonder were a volatile mix in his veins, and words tumbled out before his mind could properly form them. He suggested building 3 shelters, one for Jesus, one for Moses, one for Elijah, a desperate human attempt to institutionalize the divine, to make the fleeting permanent. He wanted to stay here, to freeze this moment forever in a shrine of wood and stone, to live always in the brilliant, untroubled light of the mountaintop, far from the conflicts and fears waiting for them below. Even as he spoke, a bright cloud descended, enveloping them in a mist that was both light and substance, a presence that was both comforting and terrifying. From within the cloud came a voice, a sound that was not of air vibrating but of creation itself, speaking deep and resonant, declaring Jesus to be the beloved Son. The words were not just heard, they were felt, a vibration that went straight to the bone. The 3 disciples fell on their faces, utterly overcome, pressing their foreheads to the cold stone, certain they were about to be consumed by the sheer weight of this holiness. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The light faded, the cloud lifted, and the crushing presence withdrew. A gentle touch on Peter's shoulder made him dare to look up. It was Jesus alone, his appearance once again that of the familiar teacher, though his eyes still held the echo of the glory they had witnessed. The voice still echoed in their ears, but the mountain was just a mountain again. The sky, merely the sky. Jesus did not speak of the vision. Instead, as he motioned for them to rise and begin the descent, he began to teach them, his words a sobering counterpoint to the radiance they had just beheld. He spoke of the suffering that lay ahead, of the betrayal and death that the Son of Man must face in Jerusalem. The glory of the mountaintop, he implied, was not an escape from the world's pain, but the very reason for entering into it more fully. The path down from the height led directly toward the cross. As they followed him, their legs weak and their minds reeling, they understood the terrible, beautiful paradox he was unveiling. True glory was not a light that banished darkness, but a light that was willing to be extinguished within it, and in that willing sacrifice somehow become more glorious still. Chapter 11. Who is the greatest? The argument began as a low murmur, a current of restless ambition running just beneath the surface of their shared journey. It started on the road to Capernaum, a winding path of dust and stones that had become as familiar to them as the lines on their own hands. The memory of the mountaintop's blinding glory had faded, replaced by the mundane realities of travel and the creeping human need for recognition. They had walked in silence for a time, each man lost in his own thoughts, until one of them, it was never clear who, voiced the question that had been simmering in all their hearts. Who, among the 12 of them, would be the greatest in the kingdom Jesus so often spoke of? The question, once released into the air, took on a life of its own. It was not a loud or angry debate, but a tense, hushed competition of whispered credentials and veiled boasts. Peter, James, and John pointed to their exclusive invitation to the mountain, to the private moments they had shared with the transfigured Lord. Matthew spoke of his former position, his understanding of administration and finance, skills surely needed in any kingdom. Others argued for the purity of their backgrounds, their lifelong devotion to the law, their sacrifices in leaving untainted lives behind. Each man, in the quiet currency of that walk, laid claim to a future throne, measuring his worth against his brothers, building invisible ladders of status on which he hoped to climb the highest. The shared purpose that had bound them together began to fray at the edges, replaced by the subtle poison of comparison and the hunger for a prominence they could not yet define. They entered the house in Capernaum, the dust of the road still clinging to their cloaks, the unspoken tension, a thick fog in the small room. Jesus did not immediately address their journey's discourse. He simply sat, his calm presence a stark contrast to the agitated energy humming between them. But he knew. His gaze, which had seen into the heart of a leper and the depths of a storm, now swept over their faces, and in its quiet light, their secret ambitions were laid bare. He asked them what they had been discussing on the road. The question hung in the air, simple and devastating. A profound shame filled the room, hot and suffocating. They could not answer him. They looked at the floor, at the walls, anywhere but at each other or at him, their silence a louder confession than any words could have been. Then Jesus rose. He did not summon a king or a scholar to his side. He walked to the doorway where a child stood, drawn by the sound of voices, small and unimportant, a figure of no account in the calculations of power and prestige. The child looked up with wide, trusting eyes as Jesus took his small hand in his own. He led the boy into the center of the room, a living parable in a tiny form. The disciples watched, their confusion momentarily overriding their shame. What did this child have to do with kingdoms and greatness? Jesus sat down again, drawing the child close, his arm around the small shoulders. Then he spoke, and his words dismantled the very architecture of their ambition. He told them that the true path to prominence in his kingdom was a paradox. To be first, one must be last. To be great, one must become the servant of all. And then he pointed to the child, To welcome such a one, he said, to embrace the humble, the powerless, the overlooked, was to welcome him, and to welcome him was to welcome the one who sent him. The lesson landed not as a rebuke, but as a revelation that reordered the universe. The child, with his simple trust and complete lack of status, was the model. Greatness was not found in climbing over others, but in kneeling down to serve them. It was not measured in authority wielded, but in humility embraced. The ladders of status they had been building in their minds crumbled into dust. They looked from Jesus' face filled with a love that served to the face of the child, who represented everything their world taught them to ignore, and a new uncomfortable understanding began to dawn. They felt the weight of their foolish argument, the sheer smallness of their dreams. The desire to be the greatest began to feel like a childish thing itself, something to be outgrown in the light of this staggering, beautiful truth, that in the economy of heaven, the one who stoops the lowest stands the tallest. Chapter 12. Taking up the cross, the path toward Jerusalem felt different this time, charged with a grim purpose that seemed to bleed from the very stones beneath their feet. The easy camaraderie of the road had been replaced by a heavy silence, broken only by the scuff of sandals and the dry whisper of the wind through the olive trees. Jesus walked ahead, his posture straighter, his gaze fixed on the distant city's skyline as if he could already see what awaited him there. The disciples followed, a knot of unease tightening in their chests, sensing a shift in the atmosphere, a gathering storm in their teacher's solemnity. The arguments about greatness, the shame of their ambition, still clung to them, but those concerns now felt trivial, like children's squabbles in the shadow of an approaching avalanche. He stopped and turned to face them, his eyes holding a depth of sorrow and resolve that made their breath catch. The sun beat down, highlighting the dust on their robes and the lines of fatigue on their faces. Then he began to speak, his words clear and deliberate, falling into the silence like stones into a still pond. He told them of the necessity of his journey, of the suffering that awaited him at the hands of the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law. He spoke of being rejected, condemned to death, mocked and flogged. And finally, with a chilling finality, he told them he would be killed. The words hung in the air, stark and unimaginable. This was not the language of victory they associated with the Messiah, the conquering king who would restore Israel and cast out the Romans. This was the language of a criminal, a failed revolutionary, a shameful death reserved for the lowest of the low. But it was the next part that truly seized their hearts with an icy dread. He turned his gaze from his own fate to theirs, and his instruction was not a promise of earthly thrones or triumphant processions. It was an invitation to a shared destiny of suffering. If anyone would come after him, he said, they must deny themselves. They must take up their cross and follow him. The metaphor was not lost on them. They had all seen the grim processions on the road to Golgotha, the condemned men staggering under the weight of their own execution beams, a public spectacle of ultimate humiliation and agony. To take up your cross was to embrace a death sentence, to willingly shoulder the instrument of your own torture and walk toward it. A cold wave of fear washed over them. Their minds recoiled, scrambling to reconcile this horrifying image with their cherished hopes. Peter's earlier confession, "You are the Messiah," now felt like a naive child's guess. The Messiah was supposed to wield power, to break chains, to ascend a throne, not be broken by the state, and ascend a cross. James and John, who had once asked for seats of glory at his right and left hand, now exchanged a look of pure terror, wondering if those positions would now mean being crucified beside him. This was not the revolution they had signed up for. This was a descent into darkness, a call to march in a funeral procession where they themselves were the intended victims. They walked on, but the world had changed color. The golden sunlight now seemed sickly, the green of the fields a cruel mockery of life. They wrestled with a new idea in the privacy of their own terror, their thoughts a chaotic whirlwind of confusion and doubt. How could life come from death? How could a kingdom be built on the foundation of its king's execution? The very core of their understanding was being shattered. To save your life, he had said, you must lose it. It was a spiritual algebra that made no sense, a paradox that threatened to unravel their sanity. They had left everything for him, their homes, their livelihoods, their futures, believing it was an investment in a coming glory. Now he was telling them the dividend was a cross. The fear was a physical presence among them, a cold companion on the road to Jerusalem, and with every step that brought them closer to the city, the shadow of the cross grew longer, darker, and more real. Chapter 13, Washing Dirty Feet. The upper room was a sanctuary of shadows and flickering lamplight, a quiet refuge from the gathering storm of the city outside. The air was thick with the scent of roasted lamb and unleavened bread, the traditional aromas of the Passover meal. But beneath them lay a current of unspoken tension, a dread that had been growing with each of Jesus' grim predictions. The disciples reclined around the low table, their bodies weary from the journey, their minds heavy with the weight of his words about betrayal and denial. They had come here seeking comfort, a final moment of fellowship before the unknown terrors of Jerusalem consumed them, but the familiar rituals felt hollow, the shared cup tasting of impending loss. It was in this hushed, anxious atmosphere that Jesus rose from the meal. The simple act of him standing drew every eye, but he did not call for a hymn or offer a final teaching. Instead, he moved to the corner of the room where a pitcher of water, a basin, and a coarse linen towel had been laid out for the customary washing of dusty feet, a task so menial it was reserved for the lowest household slave. The disciples watched, their confusion mounting, as he removed his outer garment, tying the towel around his waist like a common servant. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the gentle slosh of water as he poured it into the basin. Then he knelt. The sight was so profoundly wrong it stole the breath from their lungs. The teacher, the master, the one they believed was the Son of God, was on his knees before them. He moved to the first disciple, taking a dusty, calloused foot in his hands with a tenderness that was both shocking and reverent. He poured the cool water over it, his fingers working gently to cleanse the grime of the road from between the toes, the grit from the heel. The act was one of utter humility, a complete inversion of every expectation of power and hierarchy they had ever known. When he came to Peter, the big fisherman recoiled as if from a flame. His face was a storm of protest and horror. This was beyond his comprehension, a breach of propriety so vast it felt like a desecration. He could not, would not, allow his Lord and Master to perform this slave's duty for him. His refusal was sharp, instinctive, born from a place of fierce, misguided loyalty. But Jesus looked up at him, his gaze holding a profound and unsettling love. He told Peter that unless he submitted to this washing, he could have no part with him. The words were not a threat, but a statement of spiritual reality, a truth as clean and sharp as the edge of a blade. To refuse this humble service was to refuse the very essence of the kingdom Jesus was establishing. Peter's resistance crumbled in the face of that love, transforming into a desperate, all-consuming desire for belonging. If washing meant communion, then he wanted not just his feet, but his hands and his head bathed as well. His passionate, clumsy response drew a patient explanation from Jesus. Those who were already clean needed only their feet washed, a symbolic cleansing from the daily grime of the world. The lesson was being woven, stitch by humble stitch, into the fabric of their understanding. Jesus continued around the circle, kneeling before each man in turn, before James and John, who had sought positions of power, before Matthew, the former tax collector, even before Judas, whose heart was already a locked room hiding a terrible secret. He washed them all, his movements slow and deliberate, a living parable of service performed in silence. The only sounds were the drip of water and the soft rustle of the towel. When he had finished, he returned to his place, his outer garment once again covering the servant's towel. He looked at their faces, which were now etched not with confusion, but with a dawning, humbled awe. He asked them if they understood what he had done for them. They were the teacher, he the master, and yet he had served them. If he, their Lord, had washed their feet, then they also must wash one another's feet. He had given them an example, a new commandment written not on stone, but in the memory of water on skin and the touch of a servant's hands. The lesson settled deep within the room, quieter than a whisper, but more powerful than a shout. Leadership, they now saw with painful clarity, was not about sitting in the highest place or exercising authority. It was found in the basin and the towel. It meant kneeling down, getting your hands dirty, and tending to the most humble needs of others. The pursuit of greatness that had once consumed them now felt like a childish fantasy. In the quiet lamplight, with the cool memory of water on their feet, they began to learn the terrifying, beautiful truth that the one who leads must first know how to kneel. Chapter 14. The Last Supper. The lamplight in the upper room seemed to burn lower now, casting long, dancing shadows that mirrored the disquiet in the disciples' hearts. The memory of the foot-washing, that stunning act of humility, still clung to the air, a sacred fragrance overlaying the scents of the Passover meal. They reclined around the table, the weight of the shared bread and wine in their stomachs, a strange counterpoint to the hollow feeling of dread expanding within them. This was no ordinary feast. It was a farewell, though none dared to speak the word aloud. Every gesture of their teacher felt heavy with finality. Every look from his eyes seemed to hold a universe of sorrow and love. Then Jesus took a piece of the flat, unleavened bread from the table. His hands, which had so recently washed their feet, now broke the loaf with a deliberate, solemn crack that echoed in the hushed room. He gave the pieces to them, his voice low and resonant as he told them to take it and eat. This, he said, was his body. The words landed not as a metaphor, but with the shocking weight of literal truth. They felt the coarse texture of the bread on their tongues, a simple, earthly sustenance, yet he was infusing it with a meaning so profound it threatened to split the world in two. This food was no longer just nourishment, it was a testament, a promise, a terrifying mystery. They ate, the act of chewing feeling like a sacrament, a physical participation in a reality they could not yet comprehend. Before the disquiet could settle, he took the cup. It was the shared cup of blessing, a symbol of covenant and community. He gave thanks, his gaze lifting for a moment as if seeing through the ceiling to a different horizon. Then he passed the cup to them, instructing them all to drink from it. This, he said, was his blood of the covenant, poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. The red liquid glowed darkly in the lamplight. Blood was life, but it was also sacrifice, the stark evidence of a violent end. To drink it was to accept not just a teaching, but a death. They drank one by one, the wine bittersweet on their palates, the act binding them to a fate that was both horrifying and holy. They were consuming his very essence, internalizing a sacrifice that was meant to rewrite the story of the world. A heavy silence filled the room, thick with the unspoken question swirling in their minds. Then Jesus spoke again, and his words were like a cold blade plunged into the heart of their fellowship. He said plainly, with a sorrow that seemed to age him before their eyes, that one of them would betray him. The statement hung in the air, a poison seeping into the sacred space he had just created. One of the 12, one who had eaten the bread, drunk from the cup, whose feet had been washed by his hands. The shock was a physical blow, their eyes wide with disbelief, and a sudden, sickening fear darted around the table, searching the faces of their brothers. Who could it be? The question was a silent scream in the mind of every man. They looked at each other, their expressions a mixture of wounded innocence and desperate self-examination. Was it the impulsive Peter, whose faith was as fierce as it was fragile? The ambitious James and John? The pragmatic Matthew? Their hearts turned inward, each man confronting the shadowy corners of his own soul, wondering if some hidden flaw, some secret disloyalty they themselves had not yet recognized, could mark him as the traitor. A wave of grief and uncertainty washed over them. The unity of the moment was shattered. The one who dipped his hand into the bowl with him, Jesus said, was the one. The shared dish, a symbol of their deepest kinship, had become the instrument of a devastating revelation. They sat in the aftermath, the taste of the wine now like ash in their mouths. The joyous celebration of deliverance that was Passover had been inverted into a night of looming horror. The certainty of his suffering, which he had spoken of on the road, was now coupled with the devastating intimacy of betrayal from within their own ranks. They felt a profound sadness, a crushing weight of confusion. The path ahead, which had always been illuminated by his presence, now seemed to plunge into an impenetrable darkness. They had shared his body and blood, but they could not share the burden of his knowledge. They were bound together by a sacred meal, yet torn apart by a hidden treachery, left to wonder in the flickering lamplight which of their number held a dagger behind his back, wrapped in the cloak of friendship. Chapter 15. Prayer in the Garden. The night in the Garden of Gethsemane was a cloak of velvet black, pierced only by the faint silver of a slivered moon and the distant cold glitter of stars. The ancient olive trees stood as silent witnesses, their gnarled branches twisted into agonized shapes, their leaves whispering secrets in the faint, cool breeze. The air itself felt heavy, saturated with a sorrow so profound it was almost a physical presence, a weight pressing down on the chest and stifling the breath. Jesus led them there, away from the city's clamor, to this place of solitude that felt more like a chamber of judgment than a refuge. His steps were slow, deliberate, as if he carried an invisible burden that bowed his shoulders and etched lines of deep anguish onto his face. The disciples followed, their own hearts a tangled knot of the evening's terrors, the broken bread, the shared cup, the shattering accusation of a betrayer in their midst. Exhaustion, both physical and emotional, clung to them like a second skin. He asked them to sit and keep watch while he went a little farther to pray. They saw him withdraw into the deeper shadows between the trees, his form becoming indistinct, merging with the darkness. Then he fell to the ground, his body collapsing under a weight they could not see. The sound that reached them was not the composed murmur of prayer they were accustomed to, but raw, guttural pleas, a soul in torment, wrestling with a fate too terrible to name. He spoke to his Father, his voice strained and broken, begging that if it were possible, this cup of suffering might pass from him. Yet through the agony came the submission, the surrender that was the core of his being, not his will, but the Father's be done. The disciples, huddled together for warmth and comfort, felt the echo of his distress like a cold wind, but their own bodies, heavy with food and wine and the cumulative fatigue of a relentless journey, betrayed them. Their eyelids grew leaden. The urgent command to watch was no match for the sheer human need for oblivion. One by one, despite their best intentions, they succumbed to sleep, their dreams a chaotic jumble of broken bread and accusing faces. 3 times he returned to them, his face etched with a loneliness more vast than the night sky, finding them not in prayerful solidarity, but slumped in unconsciousness. His words were gentle, tinged with an infinite sadness. Could they not keep watch with him for 1 hour? The spirit was willing, he told them, but the flesh was weak. They stirred, mumbling apologies, their guilt a sharp sting, but the pull of sleep was a powerful tide, dragging them back under each time. They were failing him in his darkest hour, and the knowledge was a dull ache even in their slumber. Then a new sound intruded upon the garden's sacred grief, the distant metallic clank of weaponry, the tramp of many feet, the flicker of torches cutting through the trees like hostile stars. The disciples jolted awake, confusion and fear jolting through their veins. The peaceful solitude of the garden was being violated by a cohort of temple guards and Roman soldiers, their armored forms harsh and alien amidst the gentle olives. They carried swords and clubs, their faces set in hard professional lines, and at their head, moving with a dreadful familiarity, was Judas. He walked straight to Jesus, his step sure, his face a mask of resolve that hid the churning chaos beneath. "Rabbi," he said, and then he leaned forward and kissed him. It was not a greeting of peace, but a signal, a prearranged sign of betrayal delivered with the intimacy of a friend. The kiss was a violation, a perversion of love into a weapon, a seal on the terrible prophecy from the upper room. In that single, silent moment, the fellowship of 3 years was shattered, sold for 30 pieces of silver and sealed with a traitor's lips. The garden erupted into chaos. Jesus, his moment of prayerful agony complete, now stood with a calm, resigned authority. He spoke to Judas, his words not of anger, but of a heartbreaking poignancy, questioning the means of his betrayal. The soldiers surged forward, seizing him. A flash of steel, Peter, impulsively, desperately, drew a sword and swung, slicing off the ear of the high priest's servant. But Jesus halted the violence with a word, a touch that healed the wound as quickly as it was made. This was not a battle to be won with blades. This was the fulfillment of a divine script, and he would drink the cup his Father had given him. The disciples watched, their minds reeling, unable to process the rapid descent from peaceful prayer to violent arrest. The one they had followed, the one who calmed storms and raised the dead, was allowing himself to be bound like a common criminal. The reality of the situation crashed down upon them with the force of a physical blow. This was not a misunderstanding. This was the end. The fear that had been a cold stone in their stomachs now exploded into full-blown, mind-numbing terror. The soldiers' rough hands, the glint of their weapons, the grim finality in their eyes. It was too much. Self-preservation, that most primal of instincts, overrode every lesson, every loyalty, every miracle they had witnessed. As Jesus was led away, his gaze perhaps sweeping over them one last time, they broke. They turned and fled, scattering into the dark embrace of the olive grove, their robes catching on thorns as they ran, their hearts hammering against their ribs, leaving their teacher, their hope, and their own courage behind in the moonlit garden. Chapter 16. Peter says he doesn't know Jesus. The cold night air bit into Peter's lungs as he ran, his flight from Gethsemane, a blind, panicked scramble through the shadowy groves. Shame was a hot coal in his chest, burning brighter than the fear that had sent him fleeing. He had drawn his sword, a flash of misguided bravery, only to have the fight extinguished by Jesus' own hand, by a healing touch bestowed upon their enemy. The memory of his own impotence, of the teacher's calm surrender, was a wound deeper than any blade could inflict. When the others scattered into the darkness, Peter's feet had carried him without conscious thought, not away, but after. A desperate, clawing need to see, to know, to somehow remain connected to the catastrophe, pulled him through the sleeping city's empty streets, a ghost trailing the procession of torches and soldiers. He followed at a distance, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs, until the grim parade disappeared through the arched gateway of the high priest's courtyard. The heavy wooden gate slammed shut with a sound of finality, but a smaller side entrance remained ajar, spilling a rectangle of flickering firelight onto the cobblestones. Peter hesitated at the threshold, his body trembling with a chill that had nothing to do with the night. The warmth and light from within were a siren's call, a promise of temporary respite from the consuming cold of his terror. He slipped inside, merging with the shadows cast by servants and guards huddled around a charcoal fire burning in the center of the courtyard. The flames danced, casting grotesque, shifting shapes on the surrounding walls, illuminating faces hardened by curiosity and casual cruelty. He tried to make himself small, to become just another anonymous figure drawn to the spectacle of a nighttime trial. He warmed his hands over the coals, the heat doing nothing to thaw the ice in his veins. But his accent, the rough Galilean cadence of his words when he mumbled a greeting, betrayed him. A servant girl, her eyes sharp and probing in the firelight, pointed a finger, her voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. She declared that he had been with Jesus of Galilee. The accusation was simple, a statement of fact, but it landed on Peter like a physical blow. The eyes of the entire courtyard seemed to swivel toward him, their gaze a palpable pressure. Panic, cold and absolute, seized him. The memory of the garden, of the drawn swords and the binding ropes, flashed behind his eyes. To be associated with the prisoner inside was to share his fate. The denial tore from his throat, rough and too loud. He did not know what the girl was talking about, he insisted, his voice cracking with the strain of the lie. He edged away from the fire, seeking the deeper shadows near the gateway, hoping the darkness would swallow him. But the girl was persistent, following him with her eyes and her voice, telling the bystanders that this man was one of them. Another denial, more forceful this time, laced with a desperate oath. He did not know the man. An hour passed, an eternity of strained silence and sidelong glances. The tension in the courtyard was a taut wire, vibrating with the unseen drama unfolding inside the palace. Then another man, a relative of the servant whose ear Peter had severed, studied him more closely. The man's gaze was like a brand. "Surely," he said, his tone laced with certainty, "you are one of them. Your accent gives you away." This was no mere servant girl. This was a direct connection to his moment of failed violence in the garden. The last vestiges of Peter's courage shattered. He began to curse, to swear with a vehemence that shocked even himself, invoking oaths to a God he felt he was now betraying for a second time. "I do not know the man." As the final venomous words left his lips, the sound he had been dreading, the sound he had forgotten in his panic, split the pre-dawn air. A rooster crowed, its cry sharp and clear, a needle of pure, undiluted truth piercing the fog of his fear and lies. And in that same moment, across the courtyard, the doors to the high priest's hall opened. Guards led Jesus out, bound and bruised. The Lord turned, and his gaze found Peter's across the space. It was not a gaze of anger or accusation, but of a profound, heart-breaking sorrow, a look that held the memory of their Last Supper, of the foot-washing, of the prediction spoken gently in the lamplight. "Before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times." The full crushing weight of his failure descended upon Peter. The bravado, the impulsive declarations of undying loyalty, the sword stroke in the garden, all of it was ashes. He had not fought to the death. He had not even confessed to a servant girl. He had crumbled completely, his faith revealed as a hollow shell. The truth of Jesus' prophecy, now fulfilled with brutal precision, was a mirror in which he saw his own soul, and the reflection was that of a coward and a liar. A sob, raw and uncontrollable, ripped from his chest. He stumbled back from the gateway, from the firelight, from that sorrowful gaze. He fled into the burgeoning gray light of dawn, the rooster's cry still echoing in his ears, and the bitter tears that streamed down his face felt like the only honest thing he had done all night. He was a broken man, his world reduced to the taste of salt and the shattering knowledge that he had denied the one he loved, not once, but 3 times, and in doing so had utterly lost himself. Chapter 17. Jesus on the cross. The hill of Golgotha was a place of skulls, a barren, wind-scoured mound where the city dumped its refuse and its dead. A grim procession of flies buzzed over the refuse heaps, and the air carried the faint, sweet stench of decay, a stark contrast to the sharp metallic scent of fear that clung to the disciples, huddled at a distance. They watched from behind a jagged outcrop of rock, their faces pale and streaked with dust and tears, their bodies trembling, not from the chill of the gathering gloom, but from a horror that had sunk its claws deep into their souls. The journey from the garden to this place of execution had been a nightmare stripped of all hope, a descent into a reality so brutal it felt like a waking death. They saw him there, pinned against the sky. The cross was a crude, ugly thing, its rough-hewn timber a stark silhouette against the bruised purple of the late afternoon. His body, which had walked on water and healed the sick, was now a broken testament to human cruelty, held fast by iron spikes through his wrists and feet. Every labored breath was a visible agony, a shuddering lift of the torso that sent fresh waves of pain radiating through his ravaged frame. The crown of thorns, woven from a nearby bramble, dug cruelly into his scalp, sending thin trails of blood snaking down his face, matting his hair, and obscuring his vision. They heard the coarse taunts of the soldier gambling for his seamless robe, the mocking challenges from the religious leaders, the confused, angry shouts from the crowd that had cheered him days before. Each insult was a fresh wound, each laugh a dagger twisting in the hearts of the men who watched. Time stretched and distorted, each moment an eternity of shared suffering. They saw his head lift, his eyes, clouded with pain, scanning the faces below. He spoke, his voice a ragged whisper that somehow carried over the cacophony of hatred. He forgave them. He asked his Father to forgive them, for they knew not what they were doing. The words were so alien to the scene, so utterly contrary to the logic of revenge, that they landed with the force of a seismic shock. Even here, at the extremity of human suffering, his essence remained love, a love that refused to be extinguished by nails or thorns or taunts. Later, he entrusted his mother to the care of the beloved disciple, a final tender act of provision that spoke of a care that transcended his own unimaginable pain. The disciples watched these exchanges, their own grief magnified by the sheer, staggering grace on display. Then, in the middle of the day, an unnatural darkness fell. It was not the gentle approach of evening, but a sudden, profound blackness that swallowed the sun whole, a darkness that felt heavy and sentient, a pall thrown over the earth itself. The jeering crowd fell silent. The soldiers' dice ceased their clatter. The only sounds were the moan of the wind and the ragged, tortured breathing from the crosses. In this eerie, preternatural twilight, the world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. From the center cross came a cry that tore at the fabric of creation, a shout of dereliction and despair that echoed the agony of the garden. He felt the full weight of the world's sin, the utter separation from his Father, and the cry was the sound of a heart breaking under a burden no human could ever bear. A final, triumphant shout followed, a declaration that it was finished. Then his head bowed, and he surrendered his spirit. The moment of his death was not a gentle slipping away, but a profound, tangible event. The earth itself convulsed in response, the ground shuddering beneath their feet as if in a final, violent protest. In the city, far below, they would later learn that the massive veil in the temple, the barrier separating humanity from the Holy of Holies, was torn in two from top to bottom, a divine act of rending that signaled the end of an era. On the hill, The reality was simpler and more devastating. He was gone. The light in his eyes was extinguished. The teacher, the friend, the one they had believed was the Messiah, was dead. A Roman soldier, hardened by 100 crucifixions, looked up at the still form and, overwhelmed by the cataclysmic nature of the death, muttered in awe that this man truly was the Son of God. But for the disciples no such clarity came. The overwhelming sadness that had been a constant companion now solidified into a cold, hard stone of despair. The fear that had made them flee the garden returned tenfold, a paralyzing terror that they would be next. The one who had been their protector, their provider, their hope, was gone. The kingdom they had dreamed of was a lie. The past 3 years were a beautiful, heartbreaking mistake. As the soldiers moved to break the legs of the condemned to hasten their end, finding Jesus already dead, the last of the disciples' courage broke. The sight was the final confirmation of their utter loss. One by one, they turned away from the grim spectacle on the hill. They could not bear to watch as his body was taken down, as the mother they had been entrusted to care for wept over her son's broken form. They melted back into the shadows of the city, their hearts as empty as the tomb that would soon receive him. They had followed him to the foot of the cross, but in his final, most desperate moments, they fled once more, abandoning him to the darkness, their faith crucified alongside him, leaving behind only the crushing silence of a world without hope. Chapter 18. Hiding in fear. The door was bolted, a heavy slab of wood and iron that sealed them off from the world, yet it could not keep out the memory of the cross. The room was a tomb of their own making, a small shuttered space where the air hung thick with the smell of sweat, fear, and extinguished hope. Shadows clung to the corners, thrown by a single guttering oil lamp that seemed to feed on the gloom rather than dispel it. The disciples huddled within, their bodies drawn tight, their faces hollowed by a grief so profound it had become a physical ache. Every sound from the street outside, a shout, a footstep, the slam of a shutter, sent a fresh jolt of terror through them. They were hunted men now, associates of a condemned criminal, and the authorities who had killed Jesus would surely be coming for them next. The lock on the door was a flimsy defense against the might of Rome and the Sanhedrin, but it was all they had. Peter sat apart from the others, his broad shoulders slumped, his face buried in his hands. The rooster's crow was a ghost sound that played on a loop in his mind, a merciless soundtrack to the memory of Jesus' sorrowful gaze. He had not just run, he had actively, viciously denied the one he had sworn to die for. His tears had dried, leaving behind a gritty residue of shame that felt more permanent than any tattoo. Around him, the others grieved in their own silences. John stared blankly at a crack in the wall, his mind replaying the sight of Mary's unbearable sorrow. Andrew and James sat with their knees drawn to their chests, their usual energy sapped, replaced by a listless despair. The bravado of the last few years, the arguments over greatness, the awe at the miracles. It all felt like a cruel joke now, the setup for a punchline of absolute, humiliating failure. In the suffocating quiet, the questions began to surface, whispered like heresies. Had it all been for nothing? The years of hardship, the abandoned nets, the nights spent hungry under the stars. They had traded their entire lives for a dream that had ended on a Roman cross. The one who was supposed to redeem Israel had been executed by Israel's oppressors. with the consent of Israel's own leaders. The logic was inescapable, a syllogism of defeat. If the cross was the end, then their journey had been a delusion from the start. They were not pioneers of a new kingdom. They were the pathetic, duped followers of a failed Messiah. The future, which had once shimmered with promise, was now a blank, terrifying wall. It was Thomas who finally gave voice to the darkest of their doubts. His face, usually so pragmatic, was twisted with a bitter cynicism that was sharper than grief. He had seen the same miracles, heard the same promises, but his mind, grounded in the tangible, could not reconcile that glory with the gruesome reality of Golgotha. He spoke not in a whisper, but in a low, hard tone that cut through the mournful atmosphere. How could a dead man be the Messiah? The Messiah was supposed to conquer, to reign, to establish a kingdom that would never end. A corpse, laid in a borrowed tomb, could do none of those things. Everything Jesus had said about the kingdom, about their future roles, about his own authority, it must have been a misunderstanding, or worse, a beautiful, tragic lie. Thomas's doubt was a contagion, infecting the already festering wounds in their hearts. It was the cold, hard conclusion that their grief had been too afraid to form. Perhaps they had given up everything for a ghost, a story, a beautiful, heartbreaking nothing. And so they remained in the locked room, prisoners of their own fear and the crushing weight of a hope that had died with their teacher, wondering if the dawn would bring another day of hiding or the heavy knock of the executioner. Chapter 19. The Empty Tomb. The first day of the week dawned in a haze of gray light, the sun struggling to pierce a sky the color of bruised flesh. In the locked room, the disciples stirred not to hope, but to the same leaden despair that had been their companion since the horror of Golgotha. The world outside had continued its indifferent turn, but for them, time had stopped at the foot of the cross. Then a frantic knocking, a whispered password, and the door was unbolted to reveal the women, Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, their faces pale, their eyes wide with a wild, disbelieving shock. Their words tumbled out in a breathless, overlapping rush, a story so impossible it seemed born of grief-addled minds. They had gone to the tomb at first light, carrying spices to anoint a body, only to find the massive stone rolled away from the entrance. The tomb was empty, not just vacant, but voided, the burial cloths lying in a neat, collapsed pile where a body should have been. And then, they said, there were men, or beings of light, their countenance like lightning, who asked why they sought the living among the dead. The declaration echoed in the stifling room. He is not here. He has risen. A stunned silence swallowed the women's report. The men stared, their minds conditioned by the brutal finality of the crucifixion, rejecting the tale as hysterical fantasy. Peter, however, felt a strange, painful lurch in his chest, a flicker of something that was not quite belief, but was more than despair. The memory of the rooster's crow and the Lord's sorrowful gaze was a fresh wound, and this news felt like a hand reaching into that darkness. Without a word, he surged to his feet and bolted from the room, his sandals slapping against the cobblestones of the still sleeping city. John, younger and faster, was right behind him, the two of them a desperate sprinting contradiction to the mournful stillness of the Sabbath's end. They ran through the narrow streets, their breath coming in ragged gasps, the cool morning air sharp in their lungs. The garden tomb lay ahead, a dark mouth carved into a rock face. John, arriving first, skidded to a halt at the entrance, his courage faltering. He stooped and peered into the gloom, his eyes adjusting to the dimness. He saw the linen burial cloths lying there, empty and flat, like the shed skin of a serpent. But he did not go in. Peter arrived moments later, his great chest heaving. He did not hesitate. Brushing past John, he plunged into the cool, dark cavity of the tomb. The air was still and carried the faint, sweet scent of myrrh and aloes. His eyes confirmed what John had seen from the threshold. The cloths were there, but the body was gone. The cloth that had been around Jesus' head was not lying with the others, but was folded neatly in a place by itself. There was no sign of struggle, no evidence of grave robbers who would have taken the body and left the valuable spices and linens behind. This was an orderly departure, a deliberate vacancy. John finally stepped inside, standing beside Peter in the silent, hollow space. He saw the folded cloth, the empty shroud, and something shifted deep within him. A seed of belief, fragile and tenuous, began to push through the hard-packed soil of his grief and confusion. It was not yet a full understanding, not a joyful acceptance of resurrection, but a dawning, terrifying conviction that the women's report was true. The tomb was empty, the body was gone. The impossible had happened. But for Peter, standing amidst the evidence of a miracle, there was only a deeper, more profound confusion. He looked at the empty linens, the neat fold of the face cloth, and his mind, so practical, so rooted in the world of nets and fish and tangible things, could find no purchase. The facts were there, stark and undeniable, but their meaning remained shrouded. What did it mean? If he was risen, where was he? What form did he take? What did this cataclysmic event demand of them, of him, the one who had denied him? The empty tomb was a question mark etched in stone, a void more terrifying than an occupied grave because it offered no closure, only a staggering, incomprehensible new reality. They left the tomb, walking slowly back to the locked room, their minds a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, John nursing a fragile, nascent faith, and Peter lost in a wilderness of doubt. The empty tomb having answered one question only to unleash 1,000 more. Chapter 20. Jesus appears alive. The lock on the door was a futile gesture, a child's attempt to hold back the tide of a world that had turned hostile. Inside the shuttered room, the air was stale with the smell of fear and unwashed bodies, a palpable fog of despair that no lamp could pierce. The disciples huddled together, their whispered conversations having long since died, leaving only the ragged sound of their own breathing and the pounding of their hearts. The report of the empty tomb had not brought hope, but a new, more complex terror. If the body was gone, it meant the authorities had taken it, or worse, that his followers were now suspected of theft, adding a new layer of criminality to their already precarious existence. The stories of the women were dismissed as the hysterical visions of those overcome by grief. Thomas's cynical logic had taken root. A dead man does not rise. The locked door was their only defense against a reality that had become a waking nightmare. Then, without a sound of approach, without the turning of a lock or the creak of a hinge, he was there. He stood among them, a figure both familiar and utterly transformed, his presence materializing in the center of the room as if he had simply stepped through the fabric of their fear. A collective, sharp intake of breath was the only sound. Hearts that had been pounding with dread now seemed to stop entirely. Their minds, conditioned by the brutal finality of the cross and the grim logic of the grave, recoiled. This was not a ghost, not a shimmering apparition. He was solid, real, occupying space, yet he had defied the physical barrier they had so desperately relied upon. The air in the room grew charged, humming with a power that was both terrifying and holy. His first words were a balm poured directly onto their raw, terrified souls. "Peace be with you." The greeting was not a wish, but a declaration, a bestowal of a reality that his very presence made manifest. He held out his hands, and they saw them then. The wounds, the cruel, dark punctures through his wrists, the ugly tears in his flesh that should have been the final, incontrovertible proof of his end. He showed them his side, where the soldier's spear had found its mark, a scar that spoke of a heart that had truly stopped beating. These were not the marks of a ghost or a vision. These were the stigmata of a torture he had fully endured, the brutal receipts of a death that had been as real as the wood of the cross itself. Yet here he stood, alive, breathing, his eyes holding a light that death had not been able to extinguish. The fear did not vanish, but it began to transform, melting in the furnace of a joy so sharp and sudden it was almost painful. It was a joy that fought a desperate battle with their residual terror, a dizzying, disorienting elation that made them question their own sanity. Was this a collective hallucination born of shared grief and desperate hope? But the evidence was before them, tangible and undeniable. He was alive. The one they had seen die, the one they had mourned and buried, was standing in their midst, whole and speaking. The reports of the women, the empty tomb, the folded cloths, it all coalesced into a single, staggering, world-shattering truth. He had risen. Death, the ultimate enemy, the final, silent victor over every human life, had been defeated. The impossible had not only happened, it was standing before them, offering them his peace. They learned in that moment, in the locked room with the risen Lord, that the resurrection was not a metaphor or a spiritual consolation. It was a physical, historical event that had rewritten the rules of existence. The teacher they had followed was more than a teacher. He was the conqueror of the grave. The Messiah they had hoped for was more than a king. He was the Lord of life itself. The fear of the authorities, the shame of their own failures, the crushing weight of their grief, it all remained, but it was now seen in a new, astonishing light. The cross was not the end of the story, but its glorious, terrible, and necessary middle. They were joyful, yes, a wild, incredulous joy that made them want to laugh and weep at the same time. But they were still scared, for the world they knew had been unmade and remade in a single instant, and they had no idea what would be demanded of them in this new creation that had just burst radiant and alive into their locked and shuttered world. Chapter 21. Thomas believes the locked door could not keep out the story, but Thomas was a man who built his world on the bedrock of evidence, and the testimony of his frightened brothers felt like a structure raised on sand. He had returned to the suffocating room after some necessary errand, his mind still shrouded in the gray cloth of Golgotha's despair, only to be met by a frantic, joyous cacophony. They crowded around him, their eyes shining with a light he had not seen since before the garden, their words tumbling over each other in a breathless torrent. They had seen the Lord, they insisted. He was alive. He had stood among them, shown them his wounds, spoken peace into their terror. Thomas listened, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his face a mask of stubborn skepticism. The raw, desperate hope in their voices felt like a betrayal of the brutal reality they had all witnessed. He had seen the nails, the spear, the final agonizing slump of death. He had felt the world end on that hill. A ghost story, no matter how fervently believed, could not rebuild it. His refusal was not born of malice, but of a profound need to protect the shattered pieces of his own heart from another, more devastating break. He would not be swept away by their collective hysteria, their grief-induced vision. He laid down his terms with the grim finality of a man dictating the conditions of his own surrender to hope. He stated, his voice low and hard, that unless he saw the mark of the nails in his hands and put his own finger into the wound and thrust his own hand into the gash in his side, he would never, ever believe. The physicality of his demand was a wall he built around himself, a barrier of flesh and bone and scar tissue against the terrifying possibility that the world was not as solid, as predictable, as cruel as he knew it to be. He would not believe on hearsay. He would believe only on the evidence of his own senses, on the testimony of his own touch. A week passed, a strange, liminal period where the locked room became a capsule of conflicting realities. For the other 10, a fragile, wondrous hope had taken root, softening the edges of their fear. They spoke in hushed, awed tones of his presence, of the peace that had flowed from him. But for Thomas, the room felt smaller, the air thicker. He moved through their renewed faith like a ghost at a feast, an island of stubborn doubt in a sea of dawning belief. He saw their joy, heard their whispered prayers, and it only deepened his isolation. He was the pragmatist, the realist, the one who demanded that the universe adhere to its own brutal rules. Then on the 8th day, though the doors were once again securely locked, he came. The same sudden, silent materialization, the same solid presence displacing the air in the center of the room. The same words, spoken with an infinite patience that seemed to absorb all their fear and doubt. Peace be with you. But this time, his gaze did not sweep the room generally. It found Thomas. It held him, seeing through the wall of skepticism into the wounded, hopeful, terrified heart that beat beneath it. He did not chastise or condemn the conditions of his belief. Instead, he walked directly to Thomas, holding out his hands, turning to show his side, and the invitation was as specific as the demand had been. He told Thomas to reach out his finger and see his hands, to reach out his hand and put it into his side, to do exactly what he had sworn was necessary. The offer was one of breathtaking personal grace, a divine willingness to meet a human being on the exact, stubborn ground where he stood. Thomas did not need to touch them. The sheer loving specificity of the invitation, the fact that Jesus knew the precise architecture of his doubt and offered to dismantle it with his own wounded hands, was enough. The wall crumbled not under the force of evidence, but under the weight of a love that would not let him go. The reality of the resurrection, which had been an intellectual impossibility, became in that moment a spiritual certainty that flooded his entire being. He did not reach out to probe the wounds. He fell to his knees, his eyes fixed on the face of the one who had conquered death and now honored the terms of his stubborn faith. The words that escaped his lips were not a statement of fact, but a cry of worship, the first full, unequivocal declaration of Christ's divinity from any of the disciples. My Lord and my God, it was a surrender more total than any physical act could have been, the final, glorious capitulation of doubt to overwhelming, self-revealing truth. Jesus looked down at the kneeling Thomas, his expression one of profound compassion. He acknowledged the blessing of that kind of faith, the belief that springs from seeing and touching. But then he lifted his gaze, as if looking through the walls of the room and down the long corridor of time to all those who would never see his physical form, never touch his scars. He pronounced a greater blessing on those who would believe without the evidence of their eyes, who would trust in the testimony of wounds they could not touch and a resurrection they could not see. The lesson settled in the room, a final gentle teaching from the risen Lord. True faith, the kind that moved mountains and built kingdoms, was not the product of empirical proof, but the gift of a heart willing to trust the reality of the unseen, to believe in the love that had endured the cross and emerged victorious from the tomb, a love that now invited them, scars and all, into a new and everlasting life. Chapter 22. Go and make disciples. The mountain was a familiar stage for revelation, its slopes a silent witness to promises made and destinies unveiled. The disciples climbed, their steps heavy with the weight of the past weeks, the terror of the arrest, the shattering grief of the cross, the disorienting joy of the empty tomb, and the awe of his sudden appearances in their locked room. The air was thin and clean, scented with wild thyme and the dust of ancient stone. Below them, the world lay spread out like a map, the green patchwork of fields, the silver thread of a river, the distant hazy sprawl of Jerusalem. It was a world they had once known in its small provincial details, a world of fishing boats and village synagogues. Now, as they gathered around him on the high place, that world seemed to expand before their very eyes, its borders dissolving into a vast, unknown horizon. He stood before them, his form solid and real, yet carrying an authority that seemed to emanate from a place beyond the mountain, beyond the sky itself. The wounds in his hands and side were no longer marks of defeat, but seals of a victory so complete it had rewritten the meaning of life and death. His gaze swept over their faces, seeing not just the 11 men before him, but the countless generations their lives would now touch. When he spoke, his voice was not the whisper of the locked room, but the clear, resonant tone of a king issuing a final, world-altering decree. He declared that all authority in heaven and on earth had been given to him. The statement was absolute, a claim of cosmic sovereignty that made the political power of Rome and the religious authority of the Sanhedrin seem like childish toys. The one who had been crucified in weakness now stood before them as the source of all power. Then came the commission, a command that would echo through the ages, its syllables charged with the weight of eternity. He told them to go, not to return to their nets, not to hide in the upper room, but to go out, to leave the familiar shores of Galilee and the troubled streets of Jerusalem behind. Their mission field was no longer a single nation, a single people. It was all nations. The entire world, in its bewildering diversity of languages, cultures, and creeds, was now the scope of their calling. They were to make disciples, to baptize them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and to teach them to obey everything he had commanded. The task was staggering in its immensity. They were a handful of uneducated men, their ranks still thin from the defection of Judas, their courage so recently proven to be a fragile thing. How could they possibly confront empires, navigate foreign lands, and translate the profound mysteries of the kingdom for people whose very gods were alien to them? A new purpose ignited within them, a flame fanned by his authority and his presence. It was a purpose that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. Calling that dwarfed their former dreams of thrones and positions. They were to be fishers of men on a global scale, their nets cast into the great ocean of humanity. The fear of the authorities that had kept them locked away began to recede, not because the threat was gone, but because it was now insignificant next to the magnitude of the mission. They were no longer just followers. They were sent ones, apostles, entrusted with the most important message the world would ever hear. Yet, beneath the surge of purpose, a deep and persistent uncertainty remained. They felt the weight of the how. How would they travel? Where would they find the words to explain the crucifixion and resurrection to those who had never heard his name? How would they know which path to take, which city to enter first? The practicalities of the mission rose before them like an impassable mountain range. They had no army, no treasury, no detailed plan. They had only the memory of his teachings and the reality of his resurrected life. It was then that he spoke the final promise, the words that would become the bedrock of their courage for the rest of their lives. He assured them with a certainty that brooked no doubt that he would be with them always to the very end of the age. The promise was not of a distant, remembered presence, but of an active, abiding companionship that would transcend geography and time. He would be with them in the storm-tossed ship on the Mediterranean, in the hostile synagogues of Asia Minor, in the prisons and before the magistrates. His Spirit would be their guide, their comfort, and their power. They stood there on the mountain, the wind tugging at their robes, the vast world spread out below them. They felt the terrifying freedom and the immense responsibility of their commission. The mission was clear, the authority behind it was absolute, and the promise of his presence was unshakable. But the path forward was still a blank page, and as they looked from his face to the sprawling, unknown lands, the question of how they would possibly do it lingered, a silent prayer on each of their hearts. They were being sent into the entirety of creation with a story that could save the world, armed with nothing but a promise and the dawning, humbling realization that it would have to be enough. Chapter 23. Jesus Goes to Heaven. The path to Bethany was a road of farewells, every stone and twist of the way saturated with the weight of a final journey. The disciples walked in a silence that was both heavy and holy, their minds a tapestry woven with the threads of 3 impossible years, the call by the sea, the mountaintop's blinding glory, the shattering darkness of the cross, and the world-altering dawn of the empty tomb. Now he was leading them one last time, away from the city that had killed him and toward the village that had loved him, his steps measured and sure, as if he were walking not merely on dirt, but on the boundary between one age and the next. The air itself seemed to tremble with the significance of the moment, the breeze carrying a scent of time and impending departure. When they reached the familiar slopes near Bethany, he stopped and turned to face them. The 11 men gathered around him, their faces a mixture of adoration, confusion, and a desperate, clinging love. They were still grappling with the reality of his resurrection body, with the wounds that were now badges of honor, with the knowledge that the one who stood before them held all authority in heaven and on earth. He lifted his hands not in a gesture of power, but of blessing. His gaze swept over each of them, seeing Peter's redeemed shame, Thomas's conquered doubt, John's unwavering devotion. The blessing he spoke was not a simple prayer for safe travel. It was a transfer of spiritual authority, a final impartation of peace, a conferring of the divine favor that would be their only true sustenance in the days to come. The words settled over them like a mantle, warm and weighty, a tangible comfort that seeped into their anxious hearts. Then, as his hands were still raised in that posture of benediction, a profound change began to occur. His feet, which had walked on water and dusty roads, slowly lifted from the earth. He began to ascend, not like a bird taking flight, but with a serene, stately grace, as if an invisible tide were drawing him home. A collective gasp was torn from their lips. They watched, their eyes wide with a wonder that bordered on terror, as he rose higher, his form outlined against the vast blue canvas of the sky. The sunlight seemed to gather around him, intensifying until he was a figure of pure, brilliant light, a living star receding into the firmament. They craned their necks, their mouths agape, their souls straining after him, unable to process the sight of their teacher, their friend, being taken up into the heavens. He was enveloped by a cloud, a shimmering luminous veil that received him from their sight. Yet still they stood, rooted to the spot, their faces upturned, staring into the empty space where he had vanished. The world below, the rustling olive trees, the distant bleating of sheep, the heat of the sun on their skin, faded into insignificance. They were transfixed, caught in a moment of suspended animation, their entire beings focused on the point of his departure, as if by the sheer intensity of their gaze they could will him back. It was then that 2 men appeared beside them, their garments blazing with a whiteness that rivaled the cloud that had taken Jesus. Their presence was not frightening, but carried a calm, authoritative clarity. They asked why the disciples stood looking into the sky, their tone gentle yet chiding, breaking the spell of their rapt fixation. This same Jesus, they declared, who had been taken from them into heaven, would come back in the same way they had seen him go. The promise was a key turning in a lock, releasing them from their paralysis. He was not gone forever. He would return. The departure was not an end, but an intermission. The spell broken, they turned their faces from the sky and looked at one another. The amazement was still there, a bright, shining shock in their eyes, but it was now mingled with a dawning, steadfast hope. The grief of goodbye was tempered by the certainty of reunion. Without a word, they turned and began the walk back to Jerusalem. Their steps were no longer heavy with the dread of what lay behind, but light with the anticipation of what lay ahead. They were not returning as defeated men to a locked room, but as hopeful witnesses to an unlocked world. The city gates loomed before them, but they felt no fear. They carried within them the memory of his blessing, the vision of his ascent, and the angel's promise ringing in their ears, a hope that was not a fragile wish, but a solid, unshakable reality, as certain as the dawn. Chapter 24, Waiting and Praying. The upstairs room in Jerusalem was a vessel of shared breath and whispered prayers, a sanctuary suspended between the staggering miracle of the Ascension and the terrifying promise of what was to come. The door was no longer locked, but a palpable tension still hummed in the air, the ghost of their old fears not yet fully banished by their newfound hope. The 11 disciples were there, along with the women who had followed Jesus from Galilee and his mother Mary and brothers, a small community bound together by a shared loss that had been transformed into a bewildering, precarious expectation. They had returned from Bethany with the angel's promise echoing in their hearts, but the practical reality was that they were alone. The visible, tangible Jesus was gone, received into a cloud, and they were left with only his final command and the memory of his blessing. The world outside continued its noisy, indifferent life, but inside the room, time seemed to thicken, each moment stretched taut with the strain of waiting. They devoted themselves to prayer, their voices rising and falling in a constant, earnest murmur that was the room's new heartbeat. They prayed for courage, for understanding, for the strength to fulfill the impossible mission he had given them. They prayed for the Holy Spirit, the Comforter he had promised would come, though the nature of that coming was a mystery that clouded their minds. What would it look like? How would they know? Their prayers were not always confident petitions. Often they were the raw, honest expressions of their fears and dreams for a future they could not map. In the quiet moments between the more formal supplications, they talked, their voices low and intimate, sharing the vulnerabilities they had once hidden. Peter, his gaze often distant, would speak of his fear of failing again, of the deep, personal knowledge of his own capacity for cowardice. The memory of the rooster's crow was a private thorn in his flesh, a constant reminder that his boldness could crumble into dust under pressure. Others confessed their anxieties about leaving Jerusalem, about facing hostile crowds in foreign lands whose languages they did not speak. They dreamed aloud, their words painting fragile pictures of a world transformed by the message of the risen Christ. But those dreams were often followed by a sober silence as they contemplated the sheer scale of the task and their own profound inadequacy. They were fishermen and tax collectors, not kings or conquerors. How could they possibly be the foundation of a global movement? It was in this atmosphere of prayerful preparation and shared vulnerability that Peter, feeling the weight of his restored leadership, stood and addressed the group. He spoke of the void left by Judas, the betrayer, whose body had been buried in the field of blood. The scripture, he argued, had to be fulfilled. The circle of the 12, a number rich with symbolic significance for Israel, needed to be made complete again. The one who joined them must be a man who had been with them from the beginning, from the baptism of John all the way through to the resurrection, a witness to the entire unbroken narrative of Jesus' ministry. The proposal was met with solemn agreement. This was not about filling a position of power, but about restoring a testimony, ensuring that the witness to Christ's life, death, and resurrection was full and complete. 2 men were put forward, both meeting the stringent criteria Joseph called Barsabbas, also known as Justus, and Matthias. These were men who had walked the same dusty roads, witnessed the same miracles, and endured the same confusion and heartbreak, yet had remained faithful. They had been there, anonymous yet essential, part of the wider circle of disciples who had shared the entire incredible journey. The group prayed again, this time with a specific, focused intensity. They did not cast votes or debate merits. They cast the entire decision upon the Lord, acknowledging that only He could see into the heart and choose the one suited for this apostleship. Then they cast lots, a traditional method of discernment, trusting the outcome to divine providence. The lot fell to Matthias, and from that moment he was numbered with the 11 apostles. It was a quiet, orderly act of obedience, a practical step of faith taken in the midst of their waiting, a sign that they were preparing for a future they believed was coming, even as they remained day after day in the same upstairs room, praying and watching the door, waiting for the wind and fire of a promise they could not yet imagine. Chapter 25. Fire and Boldness. The sound began not as a noise, but as a pressure, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to originate from the center of the earth and vibrate up through the very stones of the house. It was the day of Pentecost, and the city of Jerusalem swelled with pilgrims from every corner of the empire, a bustling tapestry of languages and cultures gathered for the harvest festival. Inside the upstairs room, the disciples were once again praying together, the familiar walls holding their collective breath of expectation. Then the pressure broke, transforming into a roar that filled the air, a violent rushing wind that tore through the sealed room without stirring a single mote of dust. It was a wind with no source, a breath from a different world, howling around them, whipping their hair and robes, yet leaving the oil lamps flickering undisturbed. The sound was not of destruction, but of creation, the fierce, untamable force of a new beginning. As the wind engulfed them, they saw it, a flicker in the air that coalesced into separate tongues of fire. They were not flames of consumption, but of pure, living light, dancing and dividing, settling upon the head of each person in the room. The fire did not burn, it illuminated, casting a warm internal glow upon their faces, a divine anointing that seeped into their very bones. A profound and overwhelming power flooded their beings, a sensation of being filled to overflowing, of capacities they never knew they possessed being unlocked and set ablaze. The fear that had been their constant companion since the garden, the lingering shame, the anxious uncertainty, it all evaporated in the heat of this holy fire, burned away in an instant by a courage that felt as ancient and powerful as the wind itself. Compelled by a force they could not resist, they spilled out of the house and into the street, a stream of radiant, empowered witnesses. The diverse crowd of pilgrims drawn by the supernatural sound gathered around them, their faces a mixture of curiosity and confusion. And then the disciples began to speak. But the words that came from their mouths were not their own Aramaic dialect. They were the languages of Parthia and Media, of Egypt and Libya, of Rome and Crete and Arabia. The mighty works of God poured from their lips in the native tongues of every listener, a miracle of communication that bypassed the barriers of culture and education. The crowd was utterly bewildered, each person hearing the profound truths of God declared with perfect clarity in the language of their childhood, their homeland. Some, in their shock, muttered accusations of drunkenness, a feeble human attempt to explain a divine event. Then Peter stood, the same Peter who had cowered before a servant girl, his voice now ringing out with an authority that silenced the murmuring crowd. He was filled with a boldness that was not his own, a clarity of thought and speech that transformed the fisherman into a prophet. He refuted the charge of drunkenness with sharp logic, then launched into the first Christian sermon, a powerful, spirit-driven proclamation that wove together the prophecy of Joel and the Psalms of David, all pointing directly to Jesus of Nazareth. He spoke of the man they had seen perform miracles, the one they had handed over to be crucified according to God's set purpose, the one whom God had raised from the dead, freeing him from the agony of death. His voice, once broken by denial, now thundered with conviction as he declared, without a shadow of doubt, that God had made this Jesus, whom they had crucified, both Lord and Messiah. The words, empowered by the Spirit, did not merely land on their ears, they pierced their hearts. The truth of Peter's testimony struck them with the force of a physical blow, convicting them of their complicity and revealing the staggering love of the God they had rejected. A collective groan of remorse rippled through the crowd. They were cut to the heart, their religious certainty shattered, and they cried out to Peter and the other apostles, asking what they must do. Peter's response was immediate and clear. Repent and be baptized, every one of them, in the name of Jesus Christ for the forgiveness of their sins, and they would receive the gift of the Holy Spirit. The promise was for them, for their children, and for all who were far off. The response was a tidal wave of belief. About 3,000 people received his message and were baptized that day, their lives irrevocably changed in a single, transformative moment. The fearful followers who had hidden behind a locked door were gone, replaced by courageous leaders who stood in the public square and called a city to account. The fire that had descended was not just a symbol, it was a catalyst, forging a new community from the broken pieces of their old lives, a community devoted to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. The wind had scattered the seeds of fear and planted in their place a forest of unwavering faith. The transformation was complete. They were no longer merely disciples. They were the church, filled with the Spirit's fire and boldness, ready to turn the world upside down